The first line of the hymn has been sung in churches, homes, and gatherings for more than 100 years. Voices rise together, carrying the words across oceans, across generations. When peace like a river attendeth my way, it feels timeless, comforting, and strong. But what most people do not know is that behind those peaceful words was a man who lived through pain that could have broken any heart. His story was not simple. It was tragic, filled with loss and suffering. Yet, out of that darkness came one of the most powerful hymns the world has ever known. This man was Horatio Gates Spafford. He was not a preacher or a famous singer. He was not even a man who set out to write hymns. He was a lawyer in Chicago, in the United States of America. Born in New York in 1828, he was a bright boy, raised with strong faith and values. From a young age, he showed intelligence and ambition, and as he grew, he became known for his skills in law. By the time he was a young adult, he was practicing as a successful lawyer. People respected him in his community. He was the kind of man others trusted, a man who wanted to live with integrity and serve God through his life. But Horatio was not only focused on money or reputation. He had a deep faith in Christ, and he tried to live his life with purpose. He married a woman named Anna, a beautiful and faithful young woman from Norway who had moved to America. Together, they began to build a family in Chicago, which was fast becoming one of the busiest and most exciting cities in the country. Horatio and Anna loved their children deeply. They had 4 beautiful daughters and 1 son. Their home was filled with laughter, little footsteps running across the floor, and the sound of children's voices at play. For many years, it seemed like life was full of blessings. Horatio's law practice flourished, and he also invested wisely in real estate near the growing shores of Lake Michigan. His future looked bright. His family was healthy, and his faith was steady. But life, as Horatio would learn, is not always smooth. Sometimes peace like a river flows, but sometimes sorrow crashes like waves. In 1870, tragedy struck the Spafford family for the first time. Their only son, a young boy full of life, died suddenly of scarlet fever. Horatio and Anna were devastated. They had prayed for his healing, but God's answer was different. Their daughters wept, and their hearts were broken. Yet, even in their grief, Horatio and Anna leaned on their faith. They reminded themselves that their boy was in the arms of Jesus, safe from the pain of the world. Still, grief does not simply vanish. It stays. And just when they thought they were beginning to move forward, another blow came. The year 1871 became a turning point not only for the Spafford family, but for the entire city of Chicago. In October of that year, the Great Chicago Fire swept through the city. It destroyed thousands of buildings, left over 100,000 people homeless, and killed hundreds. For Horatio, it was not just a city tragedy, it was personal. Much of his real estate investments, the properties he had worked so hard to build, were destroyed in the fire. In one single night, years of financial security went up in flames. The Spaffords were left with heavy losses. Yet, in the ashes of that disaster, Horatio did not lose his faith. Instead, he became known for helping others who had suffered. He and Anna opened their homes to those who had been burned out, giving shelter, food, and comfort. They did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as servants. But the strain was heavy. Between the death of their son, the financial ruin from the fire, and the pressure of rebuilding, Horatio and Anna needed rest. They needed healing. And so in 1873, they made a plan that would change their lives forever. Friends of theirs, including the famous evangelist Dwight L. Moody, were going to England to preach and hold meetings. Horatio and Anna decided they would travel to Europe as well, both to support Moody's mission and to take their daughters on a much-needed holiday. They believed that getting away from Chicago, with smoke and memories of tragedy, would bring some peace. They booked passage on a French steamship called the Ville du Havre, a large and popular vessel that carried passengers across the Atlantic between New York and Europe. Excitement filled their household as they prepared for the trip. The girls, full of energy, packed their clothes and dreamed of seeing London. Anna looked forward to seeing Europe again, as it reminded her of her Norwegian roots. Horatio planned to join them, though at the last moment, his business required him to delay. He had matters connected to the rebuilding of Chicago that he could not ignore. So, with a heavy heart, Horatio put his wife and daughters on the ship without him, promising he would join them soon. Anna and the 4 girls waved goodbye as the ship pulled away. Horatio kissed them, reassured them, and reminded Anna to keep her faith strong no matter what. The Ville du Havre set sail on November 15, 1873. The ocean stretched wide, endless, and blue as the great ship carried its passengers eastward towards France. For days, everything seemed calm. The passengers enjoyed the journey, gathering for meals, music, and conversations. Anna and the girls often walked on the deck, the children playing games while Anna looked out over the waves. But just a week into the voyage, tragedy struck again. On the night of November 23, 1873, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Ville du Havre collided with another iron vessel, the Loch Earn, an English ship. The crash was sudden and violent. Within minutes, chaos spread. The passengers screamed, the crew shouted, and the great ship began to sink. Anna clutched her daughters tightly as the cold Atlantic waters rushed in. In the darkness, surrounded by confusion and terror, she tried to keep them together. People scrambled for lifeboats, but there were too few. The ship sank within 12 minutes, dragging most of its passengers down with it. In those frantic moments, Anna fought to save her girls, but the waves were too strong, the current too powerful. One by one, her daughters slipped from her grasp. Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta, all gone into the deep, cold waters. Anna was pulled unconscious from the sea, clinging to a piece of wreckage. Rescued by a sailor, she was one of the few survivors. Out of 313 passengers on board, only 61 were saved. When Anna reached Cardiff, Wales, days later, she sent a heartbreaking telegram to her husband back in Chicago. It contained only 2 words: saved alone. Those 2 words cut deeper than any wound Horatio had ever felt. His wife had survived, but all 4 of their daughters were gone. The man who once had a thriving practice, the man who once had 5 children laughing in his home, now had lost almost everything. His heart was shattered. Yet, this was only the beginning of the hymn story. The telegram arrived in Chicago with the weight of thunder. It was short, only 2 words, yet those words carried the heaviest sorrow a father could ever know. Saved alone. Horatio read it again and again, his hands trembling, his breath catching in his chest. His wife, Anna, had survived the shipwreck, but all 4 of their daughters were gone. Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and little Tanetta all drowned in the cold Atlantic. The house that had once been filled with laughter was now silent. The memory of his son's death, the pain of the Great Chicago Fire, and now this. It seemed as though grief had taken up permanent residence in Horatio's life. Some men, faced with such devastation, would have turned bitter. Some would have shaken their fists at heaven and cursed God for allowing so much loss. But Horatio was different. His faith was not shallow, and though his heart bled, he did not let go of God. As soon as he received the message, he knew what he must do. He had to go to Anna. She was alone in Wales, grieving not only her daughters but also the horror of the sea. Horatio could not let her carry that burden alone. He booked the earliest passage he could find across the Atlantic. In late November 1873, he boarded an English vessel bound for Europe. As the ship moved through the cold waters of the Atlantic, Horatio's heart was heavy with sorrow. Every wave seemed to echo the cries of his daughters. He could see their faces in his mind: Annie's gentle smile, Maggie's curious eyes, Bessie's playful laugh, and little Tanetta's tiny hands. The sea had swallowed them, and now he was crossing the same waters to meet his broken wife. Days into the journey, the captain of the ship called Horatio to the bridge. The man's face was solemn as he pointed out the window. "Mr. Spafford," he said quietly, "we are now passing over the place where the Ville du Havre went down." Horatio stood still, his eyes fixed on the endless waves. Beneath that water, at that very spot, his daughters had slipped away into eternity. His throat tightened and tears blurred his vision. But instead of collapsing under the weight of despair, something rose within him. It was not joy, but it was peace. A strange, steady peace that did not make sense in the face of such tragedy. It was in that moment, staring into the vast ocean that had claimed his children, that the words of a hymn began to form in his heart. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. The words poured into him like a gift from God himself. The river and the sea, the two images of peace and sorrow, came together in his mind. His heart was crushed, but his soul was secure. He could not change what had happened, but he could choose to trust the one who held his daughters now. Horatio pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. The tears fell freely, but his hand moved steadily. Each line was not just poetry, it was confession, faith, and surrender. He was telling the world that even when everything is lost, faith in Christ remains. By the time the ship reached Europe, Horatio had the beginning of a hymn that would carry comfort to millions in the generations to come. When he arrived in Wales, he rushed to Anna. The moment they saw each other, they fell into each other's arms and wept. There were no words that could fill the emptiness in their hearts. Yet together, they whispered the only truth they could cling to. God gave us our daughters, and He has taken them. Someday, we will see them again. In the months that followed, the Spaffords remained in Europe for a time, trying to heal. Their grief was heavy, but their faith held them. They spent time with friends like Dwight L. Moody and Ira Sankey, two evangelists who were spreading the gospel across England. Moody was deeply moved by Horatio's words, and he encouraged him to share the hymn more widely. "It is well with my soul," Moody told him, "is not only your story. It is the story of every believer who suffers yet holds on to Christ. The world needs these words." Horatio and Anna eventually returned to Chicago, but life there would never be the same. Their home felt emptier, their hearts bruised.
Yet they clung to each other and to God's promise that He was near to the brokenhearted. In 1876, the hymn was first published. The words were powerful, but it was the music that would help it soar. Composer Philip Bliss, a well-known hymn writer of the time, was so moved by Horatio's story that he set the words to music. Bliss gave the hymn a tune that was both gentle and strong, a melody that seemed to carry both the peace of the river and the sorrow of the sea. He named the tune Ville du Havre after the ship that had sunk. When the hymn was first sung, people wept openly. Congregations across America and England found themselves deeply moved. It was as though Horatio's personal grief had given voice to the universal pain of the human heart. People everywhere suffer loss. People everywhere face storms. But to stand in the middle of it all and still say, "It is well with my soul," that was powerful. Meanwhile, life continued for Horatio and Anna. God blessed them with more children. In time, Anna gave birth to 3 more daughters and a son. Yet even here, sorrow visited again. Their second son, Horatio Jr., died of scarlet fever at the age of 4. The pattern of loss and grief seemed to shadow their family, yet their faith never broke. Through all of this, the hymn grew. It traveled from church to church, across the seas, and into the hearts of believers. Wherever it was sung, in a chapel in London, in a small church in the countryside of America, in missionary gatherings in India or South Africa, it brought tears, strength, and comfort. People who never knew the Spaffords still felt the depth of their story in the words. Horatio and Anna began to see their lives differently. They were not just parents who had buried children, they were vessels carrying a message of hope. They realized that their suffering had been turned into something far bigger than themselves. But their journey was not over yet. In time, their story would take them away from Chicago, away from America itself, and into a place where they would try to live out their faith in radical ways. They had endured loss upon loss, but they had also been given a hymn that the world would never forget. And so the man who once stood over the waters where his daughters drowned would spend the rest of his life declaring the same truth. Even when sorrows like sea billows roll, it can still be well with the soul.
Chicago never felt the same for Horatio and Anna after the loss of their daughters. The city was rebuilding after the fire. Life moved on around them, but inside their home there was an ache that never went away. Their neighbors still greeted them kindly. Their church still welcomed them warmly. But silence lingered where little voices once filled the rooms. Grief is not something you leave behind. It walks with you. Some mornings, Anna would rise and sit by the window, staring out at the gray smoke of the city, her hands folded on her lap, her eyes hollow. Horatio often found her that way, lost in memory. He, too, carried the sorrow heavily, though he tried to be strong for her. They leaned on each other, prayed together, and reminded themselves of heaven where their children waited. But God did not leave them in despair. Slowly, light returned in the form of new life. Anna gave birth to more children. Their home once again rang with the sound of children's laughter. They had 3 more daughters, Bertha, Grace, and little Anna, and then a son, whom they named Horatio Jr. For a while, it seemed as though joy was finally returning. The couple cherished these children deeply, perhaps even more because of the losses they had suffered. Every laugh, every hug, every little step was a treasure. Horatio was not just a father. He was a man who knew how fragile life could be, and he held on to every moment. But their road was not free of sorrow. In 1880, when Horatio Jr. was only 4 years old, scarlet fever claimed his life, just as it had claimed their first son. Anna wept bitterly, and Horatio buried yet another child. Once again, grief fell upon their house like a storm. For many people, this would have been too much. Loss after loss, sorrow after sorrow. It could have broken the strongest spirit. But for Horatio and Anna, these experiences shaped their faith even deeper. They no longer saw their lives as ordinary. They believed God was calling them to something greater, something beyond the comforts of Chicago. By this time, Horatio had already become well known for his hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." Churches in America, London, and even far-off lands like India and South Africa sang it. Evangelists like Dwight L. Moody and Ira Sankey carried the hymn with them during their crusades. Wherever it was sung, it seemed to bring comfort to those facing trials. Some sang it with tears streaming down their faces, others with hands lifted high. Horatio and Anna began to realize that God was using their pain for a greater purpose. Their hymn was not just a song. It was a message that life's greatest sorrows can be met with faith in Christ. But as they grew, their hearts also began to feel restless. They no longer wanted to simply live a comfortable life in Chicago. They wanted to dedicate their lives fully to God's service, not just in song, but in action. In 1881, the Spaffords made a radical decision. They would leave Chicago behind and move with their children to Jerusalem, the holy city itself. At that time, Jerusalem was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. It was far from the comfort of America, but for Horatio and Anna, it was the perfect place to live out their faith. Many people were shocked. Why would a respected lawyer and his family leave behind everything, friends, career, security, to move to such a distant and difficult place? But Horatio and Anna were not afraid of questions. They believed that their lives were meant to serve. They wanted to be close to the land where Jesus had walked, and they wanted to help the poor and the suffering. And so, with their remaining children and a few close friends, they set sail once again, across the ocean, not in sorrow this time, but with purpose. This journey was not about escaping grief. It was about finding meaning in it. When they arrived in Jerusalem, the city was unlike anything they had known. Narrow stone streets wound through crowded marketplaces, filled with the sounds of merchants shouting and donkeys braying. Pilgrims from many nations filled the holy sites. There was beauty, but also poverty, disease, and need. The Spaffords rented a large house, which became the center of what would be known as the American colony. It was a place where people could come for help, healing, and hope. Anna, in particular, gave herself to caring for the poor, the sick, and the orphaned. She would go into the streets, finding children who were hungry, women who were suffering, and families who had nothing. She opened the doors of their home to them, feeding them, clothing them, and praying with them. Horatio supported her fully, using his own resources to provide. They did not come to Jerusalem to live as foreigners above the people. They came to live among them. Their work was not about religion in words only, but in action. In time, their community grew. Others from America, England, and even Scandinavia joined them, drawn by the vision of living simply, serving others, and sharing Christ's love.
The American colony became a place of peace in a city often torn by division. Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike came to them for help, and the Spaffords never turned anyone away. But life in Jerusalem was not without struggle. Horatio's health began to fail. The years of grief and the stress of leading their community weighed on him. In 1888, at the age of 60, he died of malaria. Anna was left a widow, carrying on the mission they had begun together. Though devastated once again by loss, Anna did not give up. She led the American colony with strength and compassion, raising her daughters to do the same. Under her leadership, the colony grew even more, becoming a place of refuge during wars, plagues, and famines. When cholera swept through Jerusalem, the colony cared for the sick. When food was scarce, they shared what little they had. They lived out the words of the hymn Horatio had written years before. "Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." The Spafford story spread around the world. People in the USA, the UK, Australia, Canada, Germany, the Philippines, South Africa, and India sang the hymn without always knowing the names behind it. Yet the legacy of Horatio and Anna reached far beyond the song. It was written into the lives they touched in Jerusalem and the testimony of their faith in the darkest times. For Anna, each time she heard "It Is Well With My Soul" sung, she thought of her husband, her children, and the journey that had brought her to Jerusalem. It was not just a hymn to her. It was the story of her life. And as the years passed, the hymn became more and more beloved, sung in churches, revival meetings, and gatherings all over the world. Soldiers sang it during wars. Families sang it at funerals. Congregations sang it in times of joy and in times of loss. It became one of the great hymns of history, standing as a reminder that faith can withstand even the deepest tragedies.
That traveled the world. Years after Horatio's death, the words he had written while staring into the Atlantic Ocean continued to echo across the world. The hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," was no longer just a private song of one grieving father. It had become a voice for millions. By the late 1800s, it was sung in small wooden churches on the American frontier, in great stone cathedrals of London, in mission stations of India, in chapels in South Africa, in farmlands of Canada and Australia, and even in small villages in the Philippines. Wherever there was sorrow, the hymn seemed to arrive like a gentle hand on the shoulder. One of the reasons the hymn spread so widely was because of the evangelistic campaigns of Dwight L. Moody and his music partner, Ira Sankey. Both men knew Horatio personally. They had seen the Spaffords in London after the tragedy, and they had been touched by the way the couple leaned on their faith instead of drowning in despair. Moody and Sankey traveled across the USA, the UK, and beyond, preaching to thousands, and wherever Sankey went, he carried Horatio's hymn. When he sang it in his deep, strong voice, crowds wept. Men who had never cried before let tears run down their faces. Women held their children tighter. Farmers, factory workers, students, and soldiers alike were moved. The hymn's power was not in clever language or complicated music. It was in its honesty. It spoke of peace like a river, of sorrows like sea billows, of Christ's sacrifice, of the hope of his return. It gave words to what people felt but could not always say. In London, the hymn became a favorite in great revival meetings. In Germany, missionaries translated it and carried it to their congregations. In South Africa, it was sung in English and translated into local languages, bringing comfort to both settlers and native people.
In India, where Christian missionaries often faced loss and illness, the hymn was sung in small churches as a reminder that even in a land far from home, the soul could still be at peace with God. Even in the Philippines, where Christianity was spreading under both Spanish and later American influence, the hymn became known. Filipino congregations lifted their voices to the same words born from sorrow in Chicago, and they felt connected to believers across the ocean. But while the hymn traveled, Anna remained in Jerusalem, leading the American colony. She raised her daughters there, teaching them not only to sing, but to serve. The colony became famous for its acts of kindness. They fed the hungry, clothed the poor, and cared for orphans. They became a bridge in a city often divided by religion and culture. When war broke out in the region, the American colony became a refuge. During the First World War, Jerusalem was filled with suffering. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly, and people were desperate. The colony opened its doors wider than ever. They gave away bread, soup, and clothing. They cared for wounded soldiers, regardless of whether they were Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. They became known as people of peace in a time of chaos. And all the while, the hymn continued to spread. Soldiers in Europe sang it in trenches, sometimes with their voices shaking as shells exploded overhead. Families back home sang it at funerals for sons who would never return. One story tells of a small church in England during the war. A mother who had lost 2 sons to the battlefield stood up to sing. Her voice was weak at first, but as she reached the words, "Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul," her voice grew stronger. Others in the congregation joined her, their voices rising until the whole church was filled with the sound of faith stronger than death. In America, the hymn became a staple at camp meetings, revivals, and Sunday services. Preachers often told the story of Horatio Spafford to introduce it. People were amazed that such deep peace could come out of such deep tragedy. It inspired them to trust God in their own hardships. The hymn's power even reached those who were not believers. Its words carried such emotional power that even people who did not fully understand the Christian faith found comfort in its melody. It was sung at weddings, at funerals, and in homes where grief had left people silent. As Anna grew older, she often reflected on how far the hymn had traveled. She thought of her husband, writing those words on a ship above the grave of their daughters. She thought of how those words now lived in the hearts of people she would never meet, in countries she would never see. It was as if the hymn itself was alive, carrying a piece of Horatio and their story to every corner of the earth. But Anna knew the hymn wasn't really about her husband, or about herself, or even about their lost children. It was about Christ. It was about the hope that no storm, no sorrow, no grave could ever take away. That is why it had power. In 1923, after decades of serving in Jerusalem, Anna passed away. She was buried there, in the city where she had spent so much of her life helping others. By then, the American colony had grown into a community that outlived both her and Horatio. Their daughters and others carried on the work. The colony even opened a hospital that served Jerusalem for many years. By the time Anna was laid to rest, the hymn was already considered one of the greatest of all time. It had crossed every ocean, entered every continent, and been translated into many languages. It had been sung by rich and poor, by young and old, by the joyful and the broken-hearted. The words of Horatio Spafford, born in grief, had become eternal words of hope. The hymn didn't erase the sorrow of losing 4 daughters in the Atlantic or 2 sons to illness. Nothing could erase that pain. But it transformed that pain into something that gave life and comfort to countless others. It was as if God had taken the Spafford suffering and turned it into a song that would never die. Even today, in churches across the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, South Africa, India, and the Philippines, the hymn is still sung. Sometimes it is sung at a wedding, the bride and groom smiling as they declare their trust in God. Sometimes it is sung at a funeral, where tears flow freely, but hope remains. Sometimes it is sung quietly by someone alone in their home, holding on to faith in a difficult time. The hymn belongs to all who suffer, all who hope, all who believe. And though Horatio and Anna are long gone, their story lives on every time those words are sung.
That touched the world. The small church in Chicago was packed that Sunday morning. The walls seemed to breathe with the voices of the people as sunlight poured through the stained glass windows. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of men and women who had come to worship, their hearts hungry for hope in a world full of sorrow. At the front sat Horatio Spafford, his Bible open on his lap, his mind heavy with memories of loss, yet his heart steady with a strange peace. The minister spoke about faith, about trusting God in the darkest hours. Horatio listened quietly, but his mind was far away on the waves of the Atlantic where his daughters had taken their last breath, on the silent graveyard in Chicago where his son lay, on the moments of despair that had nearly drowned him. Yet, stronger than those memories was something else, a calm assurance that God was still with him. When the time came for the closing hymn, the choir leader turned to Horatio and asked, "Brother Spafford, would you share the words you have written?" The congregation turned their eyes to him. Slowly, Horatio stood, a folded paper in his hand. His voice trembled at first, but soon it grew stronger as he began to read. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." The room grew still, not a cough, not a shuffle of feet, only silence and the soft sound of Horatio's voice filling the air. People leaned forward, listening as he read each verse. Some wept quietly, others bowed their heads. By the time he finished, the church was heavy with tears and yet strangely light with hope. The choir picked up the words and sang them slowly, their voices rising like waves. Soon, the whole congregation joined. The hymn spread through the church like fire, burning into hearts. Some sang through tears, some through broken voices, but all with conviction. For the first time, Horatio felt his pain lifted, not erased, but carried by something greater. From that day on, "It is well with my soul" became more than just words. It became a testimony. It traveled from church to church, from city to city. Preachers carried it in their sermons. Choirs sang it in revival meetings. Families sang it around their dinner tables in the evenings. Farmers sang it in their fields. Soldiers carried it into battle. It became a hymn of courage, reminding people that even in their greatest loss, God was still present. Years passed, and Horatio moved with his wife Anna to Jerusalem. There, they dedicated their lives to helping the poor, the orphans, and the sick.
They opened their home to strangers and gave what little they had. To the world, Horatio was a man marked by tragedy. But those who knew him saw something else. A man who had turned pain into love, sorrow into service. Meanwhile, the hymn continued its journey. In London, it was sung in great cathedrals. In Canada, it echoed in wooden churches built by settlers. In Australia, it was sung by miners deep underground. In Germany, it was translated into the local tongue, bringing comfort to families torn apart by war. In South Africa, voices sing it under the open sky, trusting in God despite hardship. In the Philippines and India, it crossed oceans and cultures, carrying the same message of hope. Wherever it was sung, the story of Horatio Spafford's loss and faith followed. People who had never met him wept when they heard his words. Mothers who had buried children, fathers who had lost work, families who had suffered through wars, famines, and disasters, all found comfort in those simple lines. It is well with my soul. In Chicago, where it all began, old friends would remember Horatio walking the streets with quiet dignity. They would say, "That man lost everything, but he never lost his faith." And that was the truth. His hymn outlived him, outlived his tragedies, and became his gift to the world. When Horatio himself finally passed away, his body was laid to rest in Jerusalem. But his hymn continued to live, a song that could not die. Even today, when people sing it in churches or at funerals, in times of peace or in times of war, the same power moves through the words. The same story of a man who, standing over the ocean where his daughters drowned, chose not bitterness, but trust. And so the hymn became timeless. It was not just about Horatio anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever known pain, everyone who had ever walked through sorrow and come out clinging to God. It is well with my soul. That was his song. That was his legacy. And through it, millions found courage to face their own storms. The hymn that was born from tragedy became one of the most beloved songs of hope the world has ever known. The story of Horatio Spafford reminds us of this truth. Sometimes the deepest sorrows can give birth to the greatest songs, and sometimes one man's faith can light a path for generations to come. The waves had taken much from him, but they could not take his song. And as long as there are storms in life, his hymn will continue to be sung. The end.